Hello, my name is Stephanie Labou, and today I am presenting on behalf of myself and my colleagues on this project, Abby Pennington, Ho-Jung Yu, and Michael Beluha. As I'm sure you've seen, machine learning, or ML for short, is becoming increasingly popular across research domains. The thing is, ML outputs are pretty complicated to curate. There's data and code and many other associated components, and there's a lack of formal best practices for how data professionals should handle these kinds of objects for preservation, sharing, and to enable reuse. Before we can determine best practices and what minimum and ideal metadata for ML objects would look like, we really need to know what people are actually doing. How are ML practitioners sharing their ML output? The specific objectives for our project are to survey ML research objects currently published in common scientific data repositories to assess, first, which components of the ML lifecycle are being shared, second, how ML objects are being documented, and three, formally specify the core features necessary in curated ML objects to enable reuse by a user with basic knowledge of ML. To do this, we're doing an extensive search of repositories for, quote, machine learning, unquote, objects in these repositories. We define specialist repositories as those that specialize in ML objects, whether data or code or both. These tend to be popular with folks doing specialized ML research. We think of generalist repositories, in contrast, as those where users can deposit anything in terms of domain or discipline or even format. The metadata options are more broad to accommodate a variety of objects compared to specialist repositories, which offer very niche metadata fields. These generalist repositories may be more popular with disciplines that are just getting into machine learning and are unaware of specialist repositories, or feel that these generalist repositories are a better fit for sharing out research within their discipline. Now, this would be a huge amount of work to do manually. Fortunately, most of these repositories have an application programming interface, or API, with which we can automate the process of searching and querying and returning metadata. Now, every API is unique with its own documentation. Dryad's documentation is pictured here, but they have enough commonalities that we were able to develop a workflow template that worked for all our APIs of interest, an example of which is pictured here in a Jupyter notebook. Ultimately, we turned our collection of Python code and notebooks into a UI, or user interface, we call PyCurator, to facilitate easy searching and output of metadata for all objects that match a search term across our repositories of interest. And what we end up with is all the metadata for each repository in a spreadsheet. And this is incredibly rich, as you can see here. Some repositories have thousands of metadata columns. Now, we're interested in comparing repository metadata models. To do that, we created this crosswalk, a mapping of the equivalent elements of the 9 repository metadata schemes of interest. Properties that use a designated field are reported. There's a few exceptions, though, like analytics and citations, which in some cases are constructed out of a combination of fields for presentation on the object landing page. Generally speaking, properties stored in designated fields can be presented with consistency, thereby making datasets easier for end users to evaluate for reuse. We then built this matrix to visualize levels of FAIR, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, compliance by each repository. A filled circle indicates full compliance and a half-filled circle partial compliance. For example, while several of the repositories are moving towards compliance by supporting controlled vocabularies for keyword creation, Harvard Dataverse, Denodo, and OpenML incorporate controlled vocabularies into the dataset description workflow. And of course, we're interested in what's going on with the actual user-submitted metadata. We're seeing large numbers of ML objects in these repositories, and for starters, a wide variety of licenses, which are of course constrained by whether the repository has preset options or users have more flexibility. Moving forward, we'll perform a deep dive of this data through the lens of FAIR to evaluate the data sets, specifically focusing on interoperability and reusability. And we're also working to fully document PyCurator and make it available for the broader curation community to use. And finally, the main reason we began this project is to apply the lessons learned from these repositories to how we curate objects in our own collections. So thank you very much for your attention, and we'd be happy to take questions during the Q&A. I want to close by acknowledging our funding sources and especially thank graduate student Michael Beluha, who worked with us on this to develop PyCurator.
Thank you for joining me today to learn more about certifying a centrally managed multi-institutional data repository. This presentation is about the core trust seal journey with Scholars Portal Dataverse. Good afternoon. I'm Alicia Cappello, and I am the current Research Data Management Librarian at Queen's University. But before that, I was the Dataverse Preservation and Policy Coordinator at Scholars Portal. There, my main responsibility was the project to certify the Scholars Portal Dataverse. Scholars Portal Dataverse is a bilingual, Canadian-based generalist research data repository. It's available to any researcher affiliated with one of over 50 participating Canadian post-secondary institutions. CTS is a data repository certification based on 16 trustworthy data repository requirements taken from the World Data Systems and the Data Seal of Approval. Currently, the CTS application applies to all major components of a data repository, from collections management to digital infrastructure, regardless of who is responsible for each component. Scholars Portal, as a service provider, only manages the backend component of the Scholars Portal Dataverse repository. We do not manage any of the policies and procedures associated with institutional collections. That is done by the institutions themselves. Together, all of this means that there's currently no method by which Scholars Portal alone can apply for certification. Because Scholars Portal provides the backend infrastructure for the Dataverse repository, no CTS application can be submitted without our input. But because the backend infrastructure is the same for every institution, the portion of the application that belongs to Scholars Portal would be identical to all institutional applications. So in order to combine our efforts with interested institutions, we created the Scholars Portal Dataverse CTS project cohort. The first step in the project was to conduct a gap analysis, where we would break down each CTS requirement into two parts: the part that needed to be completed by us at Scholars Portal, and the part that needed to be completed by each institution. Once we knew which portions of the requirements were our responsibility, we then had to figure out what documentation we needed in order to meet those requirements. We started by looking at successful CTS applications, specifically those for other Dataverse installations, in order to determine what documentation they had used to meet these CTS requirements. From there, we were then able to consolidate Scholars Portal's requirement into 6 documents: governance information, the terms of use, a user guide, an admin guide, a security and infrastructure info sheet, and a preservation plan. Next, we compared what we needed with what we already had. And from there, we had a list of exactly what documentation needed to be updated or created in order to satisfy all CTS requirements from a Scholars Portal perspective. On the institutional side, we conducted a similar investigation. Once we determined exactly which portions of each requirement were an institution's responsibility, we reviewed successful CTS applications for examples. From this review, we were able to consolidate institutional requirements into 4 documents: collections development, deposit guidelines, curation procedures, and de-accession procedures. We went one step further for the institutions and partnered with the Dataverse North Policy Working Group through the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, formerly known as the Portage Network, to develop guidelines for each of these 4 documents. The last and final step was to actually write up the CTS application responses for Scholars Portal. Using the gap analysis, we were able to go through each of the 16 requirements in the application and write content for the portions Scholars Portal was responsible for. We were also able to provide guidance for the institutions, outlining what they needed to include, if anything, for each requirement. This project started in January 2021, and the majority of Scholars Portal's work is now complete, but there is still a lot left to do. Each cohort institution is working on their application at their own pace, but we do hope to have at least a few of them submit their applications before the end of the year. The good thing is that whatever feedback we receive from CTS regarding the portion of the application written by us at Scholars Portal will benefit all future applicants. So thank you so much for attending the lightning talks today. I look forward to answering your questions at the end of this session.
This is Developing Diverse Data Librarians, Construction of a National Internship Program. I'm Peace Awesome Williamson, Associate Director of the NNLM National Center for Data Services. The network of the National Library of Medicine, NNLM, or the outreach arm of the National Library of Medicine, supports the NIH aims to accelerate discovery and advance health by providing the tools for data-driven research and build a workforce for data-driven research and health. The National Center for Data Services was added to the NNLM in July 2021 to develop capacity for data services in the health information community. As part of these aims, we strive to center efforts toward equity, diversity, and accessibility throughout our work. As data services roles are increasing in health sciences and academic libraries, the NCDS works to build data-proficient librarians and diversify the field. We developed an internship program to provide practical experiences for graduate students from underrepresented racial and ethnic groups. Trainings include the soft and hard skills needed to enter the data librarian positions, including working on a team, understanding the data lifecycle, and working with data. These paid internships offer opportunities to gain practical experiences while working with a mentor in a guided environment on structured, data-related projects. The practical experiences developed during the internship provide participants with skills needed to be competitive for data librarian positions. Currently, due to the pandemic, these internships are remote, but we hope to eventually have internships that are flexible, allowing students to participate on-site or hybrid or virtual. Currently, our project partners include the NNLM Evaluation Center and the Data Curation Network. There are also regular cohort check-ins and discussions so that the group can also network with one another. The interns also receive related trainings, such as working on your CV and applying for data librarian positions and submitting projects to a journal. Support is also provided for submitting to and travel and registration for a conference where a proposal is accepted. As part of development of the internship, NCDS was selected as a participant in the Leading the Charge program by Hampton University for advancing the recruitment, retention, and inclusion of people of color in the LIS field. Since October 2021, the internship was developed with input from Dr. Miguel Juarez at the University of Texas El Paso as the EDI consultant and the rest of the Leading the Charge group of facilitators and participants. This is a 3-year program, and it provides the opportunity for us to begin using informed and current techniques while also iterating and working collaboratively to continue to develop the program based on lessons learned. We plan to continue to share developments, barriers, mistakes, and wins from this ongoing development over the next 3 years. Would you like more information? If so, please check out our website. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sarah Mannheimer. I'm an associate professor and data librarian at Montana State University. And my talk is called From Communities for Communities, Cataloging Community-Based Participatory Research Data. So the talk will give a little background about a partnership between the MSU Library and the Montana State University Center for American Indian and Rural Health Equity, or CARE. It'll talk about the challenges addressed through the partnership, how we customized a tool that the MSU Library had built to address these challenges, and then next steps. Should be short and sweet. So the background, the library has made a connection with the Center for American Indian and Rural Health Equity. We initially talked with them about their NIH data management plan, and then our relationship grew from there. The CARE uses community-based participatory research strategies to co-create research data with Native American and rural communities in the American West. And so the goals of the partnership is CARE wanted to make data available to community members who had co-created the research data and to whom the research data belongs, while maintaining the confidentiality and the sovereignty of the data. And then they also wanted to align with the NIH data sharing policy and philosophy to make sure that data is as open and findable as possible. So the challenges that we needed to address, however, were about sensitive data. So the data often relate to sensitive topics in community health. And because these data are co-created with very small communities, that can make de-identification difficult. Then also data sovereignty, as I kind of mentioned. So Native American data sovereignty principles state that data belongs to the communities where the research is conducted. But we also wanted some trusted data storage. So in many cases, the communities where CARE interacts and co-creates this research might not have the resources to store and preserve their data locally. And then publishing data in a repository with restricted access might not be an appropriate solution because these communities don't have a relationship with the institutions that run those data repositories. So CARE is a trusted partner to communities in Montana and in the American West. So storing data using MSU infrastructure was the best solution in our particular case. And then we wanted timely community access. So we wanted appropriate members of communities to be able to access the data and potentially provide access or findability for in-progress data that need to be available to communities to support time-sensitive efforts like grant proposals or public health initiatives. So to address those challenges, we customized a tool that MSU Library had already built called Dataset Search. And we've given talks on this before, I think at RDAP last year, but so feel free to look it up. We've written a couple of papers if you want more information. But for this project, we just wanted to catalog these restricted data sets, which was a new thing. In the past, this dataset search had only cataloged data sets that were published in open repositories. And so here you can see we've created a little restricted access symbol with the LAC. And so if you search for CARE, you find these results. And then if you click in, you'll see this is a full data record. So we have a bunch of metadata here. We have the title, we have the authors, we have this in-depth abstract and the date collected. We have the restricted access notification. Oops. And some keywords, and these are Google Scholar categories to support search engine optimization. And then you can also click request dataset. So when you do that, you get a pop-up message that says to request de-identified data, please contact CARE, and then it gives contact information for our partner there. So it's a pretty simple solution. This is a short talk, but we also gave them a metadata dictionary that they can use to provide us with this metadata. And so we have this list and the definition of each term. And then we give them a template, which is just a spreadsheet, which helps us more easily ingest the data into our tool. So next steps, we're going to do outreach to more labs or research centers on campus. This is kind of a pilot project, but there's lots more centers and research labs on campus who might have data that we could help with this tool. Then also outreach to participant communities. Obviously, one of the main goals of this project was that participants would be able to easily find and request access to the data that belongs to them. And then improve search engine optimization to support findability. That's it, short and sweet. So if you have questions, please feel free to email me and have my website under there too. Thanks so much.
Hey everyone, my name is Savannasivajothi. I'm the Data Analysis and Visualization Librarian at McMaster University. And my talk today will be about creating data visualizations that empower communities and moving beyond a transparency model. So among data justice organizations and policy reports, transparency is often one of the first calls that is used to demand accountability from governance structures as well as corporations. And this often extends into the creation of visualizations themselves because many assume that transparency will create much needed awareness. However, these visualizations can often be highly disempowering to those whom it seeks to represent. This method of approaching data visualization removes agency from both the designer as well as the end user because it assumes that the data itself can tell something about the world. Alternatively, feminist methodological arguments have critiqued this assumption of intrinsic objectivity. And through feminist methodologies and experiences working with communities, this talk will discuss some tips on creating data visualizations that can mobilize data to push back against unequal power structures and empower communities through data science. So I'm going to briefly present on alternative paradigms, such as intentionally creating human scale visualizations, employing counter data and mutual visibility, and some examples of participatory methods in data visualizations. So the first thing is human scale visualizations. So as I said, transparency doesn't automatically mean accessibility. So often simply thinking about just transparency can in fact result in the very opposite of their intended goals of creating awareness. Because often the more information that is made available, users may feel as if they have less agency and ultimately feel less informed and more overwhelmed. A classic example of this is terms and conditions, because technically it's all readable, but most people don't read the whole thing or don't have an idea of what it's talking about. So for visualizations, they're created in the first place because they're designed for human comprehension. So some examples of creating more human visualizations is contextualizing it. It's okay to have a bit of redundancy in the visualization if you're making them more accessible, being straightforward about the visualization and why you're creating them and for what goal. This is useful for you in the process of making them, but also for your audience. The second thing is telling data stories. So creating narratives in the data helps humanize the abstract nature of data, and it makes the visualization more engaging to the individuals who may have a limited understanding of the data. And finally, participatory research techniques. So this includes things as valuing knowledges that have been historically marginalized, for example, from youth, from prisoners, from immigrants, alongside traditionally recognized knowledges such as academic knowledge and scholarly information, creating research spaces where individuals and the collective can express their multiplicities and use this multiplicity to inform research questions, and to explore disagreements rather than smoothing them over in the interest of consensus, because these disagreements can often provide insights into larger political dynamics that are informing the data. So the next thing is counter data and mutual visibility. So to talk about this, I'm just going to provide this brief quote by Professor Eve Tuck in her letter, Suspending Damage, because she talks about how research, when it's trying to document harm on communities as a way of holding power accountable, it can often further reinforce harmful narratives about marginalized communities by painting a deterministic and one-dimensional notion of these people as hopeless and depleted. So some questions that you might want to ask before you start creating a visualization is, what can this research really do to improve the situation? And the answer might reveal that it can do very little or might be able to do a lot. And the answers might also reveal that it depends on who's participating in the research, who's posing the question, and how the data is being gathered and disseminated. So to go back to show an example here, this image is of a database called Little Sis, which is a free database for network diagrams to map those in power. So this is a way of taking that quote and those theories and bringing it to data visualization. So for example, instead of showing communities that are harmed by climate injustices, maybe it's actually more powerful to actually show the companies that are producing that harm, like this database is intending to do. That way, this is pushing back against damage-centered research, but it's also pushing back against the hypervisibility that's on marginalized communities, because this data and visibility on them is often used to target them further at times. For example, in her testimony to Congress in the World Privacy Forum, Pam Dixon reported finding data brokers selling lists of addresses of domestic violence shelters, sufferers of genetic diseases, sufferers of addiction. So I find this tool a very interesting one to flip that narrative. So thank you for listening. Feel free to share your thoughts and your questions. I'm excited to hear them. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Kirsten. I'm the Research Data Management Librarian for Auburn University Libraries. And today I'm here to talk to you about piloting a digitization workflow for analog agricultural data. As many of you are aware, we have a huge backlog of paper-based data and other relevant records, and it's particularly bad in agricultural research. Much of this data is at risk of permanent loss if we don't develop some better policies and procedures to handle this issue. Here at Auburn, we received a message from the head of the Department of Entomology and Plant Pathology last year, specifically requesting help with this issue because he had a couple emeritus faculty members who were in a building that they needed to repurpose that building and move them. And he thought this was a good opportunity to wrangle their records and possibly get them into a safer place for long-term archiving. This is where the libraries came in, literally. You can see here that a couple of my colleagues and I went to the hallway that has all of the file cabinets, and we are standing here thinking, how is it we can take this data in this paper record format and not only archive it safely, but ideally make it fair data, findable, accessible, interoperable, and most importantly, reusable, ideally making it open and certainly making it available online in some form, and in the best of all possible worlds, making it machine readable. But we started from this hallway full of file cabinets, and we did transport the contents of those cabinets into the library's special collections and archives. Now, before our staff in special collections and archives processed those boxes the way they would for other archival material, we asked them to hold off on that so that I and my colleague, the agriculture librarian, and then my other colleague, the bio librarian, could get into those boxes and process them our way, process them with an eye to making that data fair. And so we grabbed one of the boxes as a sample that we could go through and determine what is it that we have and what are we going to do with it? What kind of a plan can we make for data like this that will translate into other areas? And so we also recruited a student worker who is helping us to go through this material. And we are very happy that this has been an educational experience for our student worker. She was kind enough to share her impressions of the tasks that she's been assigned to. So far, we do have her scanning, but I want to emphasize that an important aspect of this work was we did not just grab the files and immediately start scanning. Our student worker actually identified some patterns in the files where there was a lot of repetition and a lot of duplication. And so we did not need to scan or otherwise digitize those duplicate materials. So that was a huge labor savings, and we are happy that she was the one who found that out. So we think that this work is a great learning experience for student workers. One of the main things that we aim to do with this project is to determine roles and responsibilities. Just as with a data management plan, with that section we often see, we want to figure out roles and responsibilities for the digitization of this analog agricultural data. And so a large part of this project is figuring out who ought to be doing what. And even with the help of student workers, even with the help of special collections and archives, the research librarians are still doing most of the heavy lifting to figure out how we need to handle this analog agricultural data. So where are we now? We are actively scanning the contents of a lot of these files, but we do want to do more. So in partnership with the student worker, who does have a computer science background, we are hoping that we can get a lot of the data tables that are currently just being scanned in the usual way to be machine readable and to be at the point where they are truly fair data that we can share out and allow to be repurposed. We also are trying to understand the amount of labor that's involved in each of these steps so that we can determine how it's best scaled up and applied to other problems and other departments. Ideally, we can go back to the department head, the head of entomology and plant pathology, and give him a set of procedures such that when he's confronted with these faculty retirements, and there are more coming very shortly, he will know what it is that he can do and what it is that we can do. And so I want to thank everyone for listening to my talk, and I am happy to take any questions you might have.
Hello, I'm Kristen Adams at Miami University, located in Ohio, and I'm going to be talking about revising and rethinking asynchronous data literacy modules with the addition of practical data visualization skills for students of all abilities. Okay, so the title of the talk is about revising and rethinking some data literacy materials. So let's start with the original project before we get into the additions. In late 2019 and into spring and summer of 2020, a group of 3 librarians, including myself and a member of the biology department here on campus, created a set of 4 data literacy modules in Canvas. There was a lot of pre-planning among the group before drafting the content of the modules. We wanted it to be online and asynchronous. And we also wanted it to appeal to our liaison areas in STEM, but we wanted it to be useful to those outside of the STEM fields as well. And we wanted it to be useful for faculty who might want to incorporate one or more of the modules into their course, or as a standalone for students to take as an online workshop. So we thought that we had a lot of bases covered in the flexibility of these modules. Okay, so the request. Not long after the launch, late in 2020, we were approached by a program in the biology department called Project Dragonfly, which you can see in the photo here. It's mostly an online program with non-traditional students in it. And the faculty there let us know that the students were at very different skill levels when it comes to making graphs and charts and things like that. And they liked our modules, but they wanted to know if we could incorporate some more practical skills. So the solution, videos seemed kind of obvious for showing somebody how to do something in a software program. And they requested that these be done in Microsoft and Google products, as that was mostly what the students were familiar with using and what was available to them. So my module was data visualization, and I made a series of videos that you can see here. Most of them are in pairs, Google and Excel. And for the length of the videos, I aimed for 5 minutes, although some of them were a little longer. Okay, so let's look at an example of a video outline. We start off with going over what the graph or data visualization is and when it is used. And then we highlight our data and click on the button to make a graph. So that's just the basic skeleton. Usually you have to do modifications and adjustments, so we go over how to do that. And then we read the graph and come up with some interpretations. And the data that I use in these videos is intentionally very, very basic because it's about how to make the visualization, not about interpreting any sort of specifics. So some of the examples include temperatures outdoors or grades on a test. Okay, so the integration and separation. The integration was intentional from the request. The Project Dragonfly folks wanted some videos incorporated into the module. So I've done that. They're happy. They're using those videos, and that's great. What was a little unintentional but turned out to be really good is the separation. Now the videos are available on the library's YouTube channel. The videos needed to live somewhere, and we already had a YouTube channel, so it was just kind of obvious that that's where I would put them. But now they're not locked away within the module, and so they're more discoverable, and people outside of Miami can use them as well. Okay, so the results, how are these videos getting used? Like how many views do they have on YouTube? I pulled these stats on January 19th of 2022, and some of them are getting much more views than I anticipated. The top 3 are all in Google flowcharts, hierarchy diagrams, and pie or donut charts. I don't know why those are the top 3, but they have substantially more views than all the others, and clearly they're getting used outside of the modules because the modules haven't gotten an equivalent amount of use as 500 plus views. So I'm happy, but kind of confused as to why that has happened. Okay, so some concluding thoughts. The general philosophy here is just to be more mindful of learners of all abilities and don't miss out on opportunities to help people from wherever they're starting at. That's a shift from theoretical to practical skills, or in the opposite direction. People in STEM, people outside of STEM, different access points, Canvas and YouTube. We talked a little bit about that. The Canvas is available to people at the university, but it is more discoverable via YouTube. And I also like to think of these as the Canvas is a little bit more substantial. So if you're looking for like a meal versus a snack, the YouTube is in little bite-sized pieces and the Canvas site is a little bit more substantial. So we'll talk about that aspect as well. And moving forward, I think that I'll make some more videos in this data visualization series since it's been really popular on YouTube, despite my not advertising it very well. And I'm also looking to build another Canvas module for this course and incorporating some of the videos and some of the philosophies that I've developed through this revision process. All right, that's it. Thanks for listening. If you have questions or want to have conversations about this, you can email me at my email there on the screen. And if you want to view the videos that I've been talking about or share them with other people, which would be cool, you can do that on the Miami University Library's Instructional Videos channel. And the playlist is called Data Analysis and Visualization. Thanks again.